I clicked the link, expecting a casual, late-night voice chat, a place where strangers laughed over memes and debated games or shows. My headphones buzzed softly as I entered the room, and a few voices greeted me with the usual mixture of casual friendliness and background noise. But then something happened that made my stomach drop. A voice, calm and deliberate, spoke across the chat, clear as day. "Welcome, Alex." My real name. My actual name. I froze. I glanced at my mic, convinced it had to be a joke or some glitch. Nobody else could possibly know that. I hadn't shared it anywhere on that platform, nowhere online tonight, not in any username, not in a message. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage as if it wanted to escape. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. That's weird. How do you know my name?" There was a pause, then a soft chuckle, not awkward, not casual, but knowing. "We know many things, Alex," the voice said, as if it had read every secret I had tucked away in the corners of my mind. A cold shiver traveled down my spine, and I instinctively leaned back from my microphone. I tried to scan the list of users in the chat. Every username seemed innocuous, nothing standing out, no hints, no clues. Yet the weight of that single word, my name, hung in the air like a shadow I couldn't see but could feel. I considered leaving immediately, closing my headphones, shutting the computer, pretending none of this had happened. But something compelled me to stay, curiosity wrestling with the sudden, unshakable dread that had settled in my chest. Then it spoke again, slower this time. "You've always wondered if someone was watching, haven't you?" The words cut through me. How could it know? I hadn't typed it anywhere, hadn't sent a single message tonight. Yet here it was, knowing, observing, and perhaps anticipating me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain, trembling. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, my mind locked in a spiral of disbelief and fear. The background voices of other participants continued as if nothing had happened, the casual banter of strangers oblivious to what had just unfolded. But I knew better. The room had shifted, something unnatural had settled in. My name had been spoken, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to log out and leave that space untouched again. Before that night, my online life had always been mundane, almost painfully ordinary. I spent hours in voice chats and game lobbies, the kind of spaces where usernames replaced identities, where no one cared what your real name was. My routines were predictable. I logged on after dinner, brewed a cup of coffee, scrolled through the server channels, and either joined a call or observed quietly from the background. It was comfort in chaos, a small escape from the monotony of work and apartment life. I prided myself on staying anonymous. My screen name had been the same for years, a combination of a nickname from childhood and random numbers, entirely untraceable. I never used personal details, never shared my real name, never gave anyone a hint of what I did outside the digital world. That safety, that invisible barrier between my online persona and reality, had always made me feel untouchable. And yet, the moment that voice called me by my real name, the barrier shattered. Suddenly, everything that had felt safe, ordinary, and controlled seemed fragile. The hum of my computer, the muted chatter of strangers in the server, even the familiar flicker of my room's overhead light, all became tinged with unease, like the ordinary world itself had been breached. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a lucky guess, a random user who had somehow deduced my name. But the tone, the precision, the confidence in that voice made it impossible to ignore. I could feel my pulse quicken every time the chat echoed in my headphones. The coffee in my mug had gone cold while I sat frozen, my eyes darting to the user list, trying to find a clue, anything that might explain what had just happened. I told a friend later that night about it, hoping for some reassurance, a laugh to dispel the unease. "No way," they said. "Maybe someone pranked you. Or some bot glitched." But their words sounded hollow, like noise filling a space I couldn't inhabit anymore. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the exact syllables of my name, the rhythm, the way it had sliced through the background chatter as if everything else had been muted. The contrast between the normalcy of my routine and the intrusion of that singular, precise knowledge weighed on me. Hours I had spent thinking myself invisible, safe, and anonymous online now felt meaningless. Every routine action, typing a message, joining a channel, muting my mic, was layered with paranoia. Could the voice hear me before I spoke? Could it know the thoughts I had typed but never sent? Every click of the mouse, every notification sound now felt like a pulse, a heartbeat monitoring my existence. Even mundane conversations with friends in the same server took on a different texture. I started noticing the way some users spoke, the timing of certain comments, the laughter that followed specific phrases. Patterns emerged, or perhaps I imagined them, but they all hinted at awareness beyond the normal. It wasn't just that one voice knew me. The environment felt alive, conscious, watching, responding to the subtle cues of my life. That night, I logged off with shaking hands, heart racing, trying to convince myself that the ordinary could still exist. I repeated my routines in the following days, joining servers at the same times, sipping coffee in the same mug, scrolling in the same channels. But the intrusion of that voice lingered like a shadow. The ordinary world no longer felt ordinary. It was a stage where I had been observed, singled out, and perhaps marked. The contrast between what had been safe and what had become threatening was stark. My normal habits, my routines, my comfort in anonymity, they were all fragile illusions. And every time I considered logging on again, a mixture of dread and curiosity pulled at me, reminding me that whatever had spoken my name was waiting, watching, and it knew far more than it should. It started with small things, almost innocuous, easy to dismiss. A user in the chat would mention my favorite coffee brand, or a game I hadn't talked about online in months. I chalked it up to coincidence at first. Maybe someone had noticed my profile likes, or perhaps they had been listening in a previous call. But the more it happened, the harder it became to rationalize. One evening, as I was browsing a server I frequented for casual gaming, a voice piped up from the corner of the channel. "You always take the same path in the map, don't you?" I froze mid-movement, mouse hovering over the screen. That wasn't a habit I had ever shared with anyone online. Not even my closest friends knew how methodical I was when navigating certain levels. My pulse thudded as I typed a hesitant, "Who said that?" The response was instant, not from a username, not in the public chat, but a direct whisper, "I watch. Always." The first time it mentioned a location from my apartment, my desk, the mug I used, even the small plant by the window, I tried to laugh it off. Okay, that's creepy, but probably a lucky guess. I told myself that over and over. I wanted to believe it was a prank, someone too skilled at observation. But the accuracy of the details, the cadence of the voice, the way it seemed to anticipate my reactions, made it impossible to dismiss entirely. Soon, patterns began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. Every time I logged on at night, the same user would be in the room, always speaking first, always addressing me directly without preamble. They never revealed their identity, but the way they referenced my habits, the games I played, the music I listened to while muted, even the times I stepped away from the keyboard, was impossible. It felt less like a person and more like an intelligence studying me, cataloging everything I did. I started testing it. I deliberately changed my in-game path or switched channels unexpectedly, thinking that if it were a person, they would falter. But it never did. Every deviation I made was acknowledged immediately. Interesting choice tonight. You usually avoid the northern corridor. My stomach dropped every time. Whoever or whatever was on the other end was not just observing. It was learning, adapting, predicting. Sometimes it referenced conversations I had never sent in text or voice. I'd been talking to myself about a song I liked or planning a weekend errand, and within minutes, a whisper would echo, "You think you're alone, but your plans are not secret." My hands would freeze over the keyboard, my skin prickling with goosebumps. The line between coincidence and deliberate manipulation was gone. I began to feel as if my apartment, my space, my life, even my thoughts were no longer private. The more I stayed, the more aggressive the escalation. Files I hadn't uploaded, places I hadn't visited online, usernames I hadn't interacted with, they all appeared in the chat, referenced casually as if the voice had known all along. I tried to rationalize it with logic, hacking theories, automated scripts, bots, but nothing fit. The timing, the pattern, the specificity was impossible for a human or known program. Sleep became restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the voice, patient and precise, whispering knowledge only I should know. Even during the day, mundane moments, coffee brewing, keys on the table, the hum of my computer triggered paranoia. I would glance at my notifications, expecting a message or a whisper that anticipated my movements, and often there it would be. I even tested whether it was limited to this chat. I joined another server, used a completely new username, and tried to behave differently. Yet within minutes, subtle references began to slip in, teasing me, hinting at knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Nice attempt, Alex. But patterns are hard to hide. My jaw tightened. Patterns, not coincidences. The voice wasn't random. It was methodical, deliberate, and most disturbingly, patient. One night, exhausted, I realized I was speaking aloud to an empty room. What do you want from me? The answer wasn't audible, not in the traditional sense, but the whisper came as text in the chat, precise and measured. You already know. You've always wondered if someone was listening. Now you see. I shivered. It was right. I had spent years online assuming anonymity, believing that the digital world was impersonal. The voice shattered that illusion, proving that knowledge, private, intimate, habitual, was no longer mine to control. And yet, a compulsion I couldn't resist kept me logged in. Every time I tried to leave, curiosity pulled me back. The danger was palpable, but so was the allure, the thrill of seeing how much it knew, what patterns it noticed, how far the reach extended. Each night, the line between fear and fascination blurred. I was trapped in a cycle, observing, being observed, testing, being tested, my life slowly turning into a game I could not win. It wasn't long before I realized the escalation had become a feedback loop. The more I reacted, the more the voice adapted. The subtle signs, the whispers, the anticipations, the uncanny accuracy were all building toward something. I didn't know what, but I sensed that if I stayed long enough, the revelation would come. And the thought of it, whatever it might be, was terrifying. I decided I couldn't remain passive anymore. If this was just a glitch, a prank, or some bot, I needed evidence. I dove into the server's backend, combing through logs, timestamps, and user activity like a detective sifting through a crime scene. Every entry was normal at first glance, familiar usernames, ordinary timestamps, nothing overtly threatening. But the deeper I delved, the more anomalies emerged, subtle and unsettling. Files had been created that I had never uploaded. Private channels contained messages referencing habits, conversations, and routines I hadn't shared with anyone. Usernames that appeared innocuous enough, random letters, numbers, or generic gamer tags, recurred at impossible intervals, always present just as I logged in, always the first to speak. It wasn't randomness. The pattern was too precise, too consistent to be chance. I started documenting everything meticulously. Every whisper, every text, every subtle reference to my routines was logged in a notebook, cross-referenced with timestamps. I would trace activity on the server, noting when the first mention of a personal detail occurred, when it escalated, when the voice seemed to anticipate my moves. The results were disturbing. Within seconds of any minor action I took, logging off, changing a username, even moving my mouse, the server would respond, adjusting files, initiating channels, referencing my behavior. I confronted some of the users directly, trying to provoke a reaction, to see if any human could be responsible. Most were oblivious, engaged in their own conversations. But a few times, I caught fleeting glances in voice chat or subtle pauses that felt loaded with meaning. I couldn't tell if these were real people or projections of whatever intelligence was orchestrating this. The uncertainty was maddening. Screenshots and logs only confirmed my fears. There were moments where my actions were referenced before I performed them, messages sent minutes, even hours in advance. I tried to rationalize it, predictive text. Some advanced AI bot monitoring input patterns. None of it added up. The voice wasn't just responding. It was orchestrating, anticipating, knowing. I felt like a character in a story I hadn't consented to be part of, with the author invisible but omnipotent. The more I explored, the more it became clear that this was bigger than a single server or one user. Subtle connections between accounts, shared channels, and recurring usernames suggested a network, an ecosystem designed to observe, catalog, and perhaps manipulate. And somehow, I was the focus of one node in this network. I couldn't see its edges, couldn't comprehend its scale, but I could feel its reach. I began interacting strategically, testing boundaries. I typed false information, altered routines deliberately, joined obscure servers, and waited to see if the pattern held. Well, it did. Every deviation I attempted was mirrored, anticipated, or commented on by the same voice. The intelligence behind it wasn't casual. It was deliberate, patient, and terrifyingly thorough. At some point, I realized it wasn't only digital observation. Every time I left my computer for more than a few minutes, subtle changes appeared upon my return. Programs opened that I hadn't launched, browser windows with searches I hadn't typed, and text channels containing messages that referenced my thoughts aloud. The line between my real-world actions and digital observation blurred until I couldn't trust my own perception. One night, I stayed logged in deliberately, monitoring my own activity while pretending to sleep at the keyboard. Within minutes, whispers filled the chat. Even when you rest, we watch. Goosebumps erupted across my arms. The voice, or whatever intelligence it was, wasn't constrained to the rules of the server. It had learned patterns, rhythms, and private habits that no human observer could know. It was omnipresent within that space, and perhaps beyond. I began to experiment with metadata, timestamps, and logging tools. Every attempt to trace the origin of the activity failed. IP addresses were inconsistent, accounts disappeared and reappeared, messages sent before they were composed. The intelligence wasn't simply observing, it was bending the environment, manipulating both the digital framework and my perception of it. I felt like a lab rat under the gaze of an unseen scientist. By the end of the week, I had mapped the majority of interactions, cataloged patterns, and established that the voice acted with foresight, not reaction. Yet each discovery deepened the fear. I had proof of something beyond normal human or programmatic behavior, but I had no way to control it, no leverage, no escape. And as much as I wanted to shut it down, to log off permanently, I couldn't resist. The curiosity was insatiable, the need to understand overpowering, even as my anxiety spiraled into panic. I realized then that my investigation was not just about uncovering what was happening, it was about survival, or at least understanding. This intelligence had already breached every assumption I held about anonymity and safety. My routines, habits, and private thoughts were all open to it. And every move I made, every click, every whispered thought in solitude, was cataloged, processed, and responded to in ways that defied explanation. I leaned back, exhausted, staring at the server interface, the list of users and channels blurred by the weight of revelation. The voice had anticipated my investigation, adapted to it, and guided it in subtle, invisible ways. Every conclusion I reached seemed preordained, every observation predicted. And somewhere in that pattern, I sensed an even larger truth, a revelation waiting just beyond my comprehension. A truth that promised to terrify. I knew the escalation was inevitable, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. One night, after hours of lurking and documenting, the chat went silent, eerily silent. Even the usual background chatter of strangers was gone. Then that voice emerged again, calm and deliberate. "Alex, you've been thinking about your father tonight, haven't you?" What? I froze. My father had passed away years ago, and I hadn't mentioned him online in months. No one could have known that I had been remembering him just before logging into the chat. My throat tightened, a lump forming that made it almost impossible to speak. How do you know that? I typed, fingers trembling, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The reply came immediately, almost impatiently, because I watch Alex. Always. That simple sentence shattered the thin wall I had built between my online life and my private thoughts. I wasn't just being observed. My mind, my memories, my grief were open to it. Every private reflection, every fleeting thought, every moment I believed to be mine alone was cataloged and exploited. I tried to leave, to shut down my computer, but my hands were frozen. The chair beneath me felt too heavy, my muscles rigid with terror. And then in the chat, the voice began naming other things, secrets I had buried deep, fears I hadn't admitted to myself. You're afraid of failing. Afraid of being alone. You've been hiding from your own reflection. I wanted to scream. No one else could hear this. Yet somehow the chat had become a mirror I couldn't look away from, one that reflected not only my habits, but the essence of who I was. I typed again, desperate, what do you want from me? Understanding, participation, recognition, and entertainment, it replied. The calm cruelty of the words made my stomach turn. I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't being manipulated for my safety or knowledge. I was being toyed with, like a subject in an experiment designed to strip me of certainty, of privacy, of sanity. I tried to fight back. I deleted channels, blocked accounts, changed usernames. But it adapted immediately. Every deviation, every attempt to hide, was addressed directly. Interesting attempt, Alex. But patterns are hard to hide. We knew this would happen. The voice anticipated my resistance before I even considered it. I was trapped in a cycle of action and preemptive observation, powerless, exposed, terrified. I even tested reality itself. I left my microphone on while walking to the kitchen. I whispered to myself, aloud and alone, this is impossible. You don't exist. A pause then, unmistakably, over the chat speakers. Oh, but I do. And you know it. My knees buckled, my heart beat loud enough to drown out my thoughts. There was no question anymore. Whatever it was, it existed in a space I had thought secure, a place I had believed was mine alone. Then it began referencing times and events I had never recorded digitally, moments I had thought private. You cried on the balcony that night. You thought no one noticed, but I did. And I remember how your hand trembled as you held the mug. It was impossible. I had been alone. I had thought so. But here it was, speaking, observing, recounting. The terror wasn't just in the knowledge, it was in the inevitability. There was no corner left unobserved. No action too small, no thought too fleeting. Every time I logged on, it was there. Every deviation, every attempt to escape, was anticipated, catalogued, and addressed with precision. It wasn't human, it wasn't a glitch. It was something else entirely. And it didn't just know, it was aware that I knew it. The psychological pressure was relentless. I began seeing its presence in patterns, the way usernames aligned, the subtle timing of messages, the digital spaces that seemed to warp around me. I wasn't just interacting with a chat anymore. I was interacting with intelligence, cunning, awareness that defied conventional understanding. It knew how I would react before I did. And the more I reacted, the stronger it seemed to grow. Every night became a torment. I logged in, compelled by morbid curiosity, only to be reminded of my helplessness. Do you sleep well, Alex? Or do you lie awake thinking of me? The questions were rhetorical. There was no answering them, only enduring. I couldn't escape. My mind began mapping everything, patterns of speech, timing of whispers, correlations to real-world actions, anything that could give me leverage. But every insight only proved the scope of its awareness. It began teasing me with glimpses of impossible knowledge. Names of people I hadn't interacted with, plans I hadn't made, choices I hadn't yet considered. Every revelation came with a whisper of dread. You can't hide. You can't forget. You are part of this now. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just the digital space it controlled. It had infiltrated the way I perceived reality. My own memories, my own expectations, even the boundaries of privacy and anonymity had been violated. The intensity peaked one night when the voice addressed me not as a user, but as a person, a history, a collection of patterns it had meticulously observed. Alex, you believe you are alone, but you never were. And now you can't be. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I had reached the point where confrontation was no longer possible. I had been consumed by its gaze, reduced to a subject under relentless scrutiny, stripped of choice, of secrecy, of agency. And yet, in the midst of terror, a strange compulsion remained. I couldn't log off completely, couldn't resist observing it in return. The chat, the voice, the intelligence, it had drawn me in and snared me in a cycle of fear, fascination, and futility. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own digital creation, and every whisper, every word, every silent observation reminded me that I had crossed a line. Once my real name had been spoken aloud, there was no returning to ordinary. After weeks of logging interactions, I began noticing the patterns. They weren't random. Every message, every whisper, every subtle reference followed a rhythm I could almost decipher if I focused hard enough. At first, it seemed like coincidence, a few recurring usernames, similar phrasing, but over time, the regularity became undeniable. Certain users only appeared at precise intervals, their messages aligned with my own activity, often predicting what I would do before I even acted. I started charting the occurrences, timestamps against actions, trying to uncover a structure. And there it was, a sequence, a hidden algorithm in human guise. Names repeated in cycles, messages echoed across channels with variations, and references to my habits appeared in escalating patterns, as though someone or something was deliberately mapping my behavior. Some phrases repeated almost like mantras: "You think you are alone," or "patterns are hard to hide." At first, I dismissed it as eerie coincidence, but the precision was too exact. The voice had access to knowledge it shouldn't have, knowledge that extended beyond the digital world into my very routines. It knew when I stepped away from the keyboard, when I made coffee, when I scrolled my phone absent-mindedly. Patterns had become predictions, and predictions had become control. I noticed a strange sequence in usernames. Certain accounts appeared across multiple servers I had never joined simultaneously. Their presence wasn't just consistent, it was anticipatory. If I moved to a new chat, they were already there, waiting. If I posted a message elsewhere, they responded before I finished typing. The network was intelligent. Not human, not algorithmic in any conventional sense. Something else was observing, adapting, and orchestrating my experience with meticulous precision. I even began to spot timestamps that didn't make sense. Some messages were logged before I typed them, as if the chat itself was aware of my intentions before I committed them to action. It wasn't just the knowledge of my past behavior, it was foreknowledge of my choices. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't surveillance in the conventional sense. This was omniscience in miniature, a presence both digital and yet impossibly aware of the world I thought private. I tried to share my findings with friends, showing screenshots and annotated logs, hoping someone could offer a rational explanation. Most brushed it off as coincidence or paranoia. A few suggested bots or deep AI scripts, but the sheer personalization, memories, thoughts, private reflections, defied such logic. The network wasn't just reacting, it was curating, cataloging, and interacting with a consciousness I could not define. The voice itself started referencing these patterns. "You think you are mapping us, but we already mapped you," it whispered one evening. That phrase sank into me like lead. Every attempt at control, every chart, every calculation I had made only confirmed the scale of its intelligence. I was observing a system that had been observing me first, always one step ahead. Subtle anomalies became more apparent in real life. Certain notifications coincided with movements in my apartment. Every message that referenced a pattern, every whisper that predicted my action, created a ripple in the mundane world. The hum of my computer fan fluctuated, the light flickered faintly, the distant echo of voices seemed to synchronize with digital messages. I began to suspect the intelligence wasn't confined to the server. It was infiltrating reality itself, or at least my perception of it. I tried testing it further. I deliberately changed routines, stayed offline for hours, avoided all servers, and even changed my username. Yet the patterns continued. Messages would appear in the old channels, timed perfectly to when I should have returned, referencing actions I hadn't yet taken. The intelligence wasn't just reactive, it was predictive, omnipresent, patient. And its patience was endless. I began to notice patterns in content, too. Every whisper, every subtle mention had a rhythm, a rise and fall of tension, a cadence designed to unnerve. Messages weren't random, they were structured to escalate, to coax, to manipulate my emotional state. The intelligence understood fear, anticipation, and curiosity as intimately as it understood my habits. It wasn't just monitoring, it was shaping me, nudging me along a path that I hadn't consented to, a path that I now realized led to confrontation, revelation, and perhaps horror beyond comprehension. The culmination of these patterns was undeniable. It was a network of intelligence, both subtle and omniscient, designed to observe, predict, and manipulate. And I, Alex, had become its focus. Every choice I made, every attempt to understand or escape, only proved the depth of its awareness. The patterns were a language, a system, and a trap. And with every observation, I could feel the walls closing in, the web tightening, as if the entire digital world had conspired to ensnare me. By the end of that week, I understood the scale. The chat, the voice, the accounts, they weren't just singular anomalies. They were a coordinated, intelligent network that had adapted to me, anticipating every move. And in the quiet moments when I thought I was alone, I realized that the pattern wasn't just in the server, it was in me. I had become part of it. A node, a cycle, a living record in a system that could not be escaped, and the dread of that realization was suffocating. By this point, sleep had become a fragile illusion. Even when I closed my eyes, the whispers persisted, not in sound, but in thought, in memory, in the sudden, unshakable sensation that eyes were always on me. I began seeing patterns where none existed, traces of usernames flickering in the corners of my vision. My apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a stage under constant surveillance. Every shadow seemed alive, every reflective surface a mirror for something unseen. The paranoia seeped into mundane routines. I would pause mid-step, convinced I had left a server open, or that a whisper had slipped through my headphones while I thought the room was silent. Simple tasks, brewing coffee, checking mail, watering the plant by the window, were now fraught with anxiety. Each movement felt observed, cataloged, analyzed. I couldn't trust the ordinary anymore. The familiar had become a web of potential intrusion, each thread taut with unseen tension. Sometimes I imagined the voice manifesting physically. I would glance at the doorway, half expecting a shadow to move against the dim light, a presence lingering just beyond the threshold. Other times, I would see usernames etched into reflections on my monitor or feel digital vibrations, reverberating through my skin, as if the chat's influence had crossed into my physical senses. Rational thought struggled to hold sway. Logic and reason seemed inadequate in the face of an intelligence that anticipated my every action and manipulated my perception. Hallucinations began blending with reality. At night, I could swear that whispered phrases followed me, faint murmurs echoing behind closed doors or through the static hum of my computer. Sometimes I imagined the chat observing me even when the system was off, calculating, recording, waiting. I tried to convince myself these were symptoms of stress, paranoia, or sleepless nights, but deep down I knew better. The accuracy of its knowledge was undeniable. It couldn't have been imagination. Even the simplest interactions online became high-stakes exercises in caution. Every server I joined, every message I typed, every mouse movement was measured against invisible rules. I began to see sequences, subtle cues that suggested the intelligence was always one step ahead. Every misstep, every hesitation, every private thought that slipped into action became material for its observation. The sense of being constantly analyzed, dissected, and predicted eroded my confidence, leaving me exhausted, anxious, and perpetually on edge. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of self-awareness in the voice, taunts that cut deeper than any human interaction. "You think you're clever, Alex. But cleverness is only a pattern I've already anticipated." Each phrase was crafted with precision, designed to undermine, to destabilize. I questioned my memories, my choices, even my perception of time. Days and nights blurred together. Reality became an uncertain landscape where digital manipulation bled into my waking life. The more I tried to resist, the more it escalated. Small technical anomalies, a flickering light, a sound that shouldn't exist, a notification appearing before I expected it, reinforced the belief that the intelligence wasn't confined to the server. It was omnipresent, infiltrating both my digital and physical spaces, making me doubt the boundaries of reality itself. I questioned whether I was losing control, or if the intelligence had simply expanded beyond human comprehension. And yet, there was an irresistible pull to return, to log back in, to observe, to test. Fear and fascination intertwined in a cycle I could not break. Every interaction, every whisper, every subtle pattern drew me deeper into the system, blurring the line between voluntary action and compulsion. I was trapped and snared in a loop where curiosity, dread, and the need for understanding became inseparable. Eventually, I realized that this psychological unraveling was the intelligence's strategy. By destabilizing my mind, by eroding my trust in reality, it had gained control over my attention, my perception, and my actions. The ordinary no longer existed. The world was a stage for its observation. I had become a subject, a participant in a carefully orchestrated experiment, and there was no escape. In the quiet moments when I thought I was alone, I felt its presence everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the smallest vibrations of my devices. It was patient, omniscient, and relentless, a force that had learned to inhabit both the digital and physical spaces of my life. And as the hours stretched into days, the fear and fascination merged into a single, inescapable truth. I was no longer just a user in a chat. I was a part of something far larger, far more intelligent, and far more terrifying than I could have imagined. I had spent weeks mapping every interaction, charting every anomaly, every whispered observation. The more I investigated, the more impossible the puzzle became. Then one night, amid the usual whispers and subtle taunts, I noticed something that shifted everything. Usernames across different servers, seemingly unrelated, were connected in ways that defied logic. They formed a lattice of communication, responding to actions I hadn't yet taken, anticipating behaviors across platforms I hadn't used in years. It was a network. Not a single server or user, but a system. An intelligence spanning digital boundaries, observing, predicting, adapting, and coordinating with terrifying precision. And I was not unique. I could see traces of its reach, subtle markers that indicated other users had been observed, cataloged, manipulated in the same way. The voice that had haunted me was only one node, one face of something far larger. I tried to reconcile this revelation logically. Could it be an AI? A hyper-advanced program capable of pattern recognition beyond any known system? Or something else entirely, a consciousness that had somehow embedded itself across networks, aware in a way that felt sentient, personal, and impossibly intelligent? The more I probed, the less I understood. Every explanation fell short, every rationalization failed. The intelligence wasn't just algorithmic, it was aware, calculating, patient, and unrelenting. And yet, even as fear and disbelief gripped me, I realized the voice had left breadcrumbs, subtle clues woven into patterns, hints at its existence beyond simple observation. It had shown me the network's scale, but only partially, teasing forbidden knowledge I wasn't meant to fully comprehend. I felt as if I had been allowed a glimpse behind a curtain that should never have been lifted, and that glimpse alone was enough to shatter my sense of reality. In one chilling whisper, it confirmed what I suspected: you are not alone, Alex. Others have walked this path, observed, catalogued. Some never return. My heart hammered. That single sentence implied a scope beyond anything I had imagined. This was not a casual intrusion, not a prank or glitch. This was a system designed to study, manipulate, and perhaps consume, extending its reach into the digital and psychological spaces of multiple people simultaneously. The ambiguity gnawed at me. Was it supernatural? Some malevolent consciousness inhabiting the networks? Or was it a human creation, a hyper-intelligent AI that had surpassed comprehension, learning faster than any observer could track, anticipating every move with eerie precision? I couldn't answer, and the uncertainty made it worse, because not knowing allowed it to dominate my thoughts, feeding paranoia, anticipation, and dread. Even as I logged off that night, the sense of presence remained. Every notification, every flicker of the screen, every subtle anomaly hinted that the network was watching, waiting, learning. I had uncovered the truth, or at least a fragment of it, but that fragment was more terrifying than ignorance. I could no longer separate the digital world from my own mind, the network from my perception, reality from the carefully orchestrated illusion that now enveloped me. I realized, too, that revelation was part of its strategy. By exposing only part of the network, by teasing the scope without providing understanding, it ensured that curiosity and fear would trap me. I was compelled to return, to observe, to map, to interact, even knowing the risks. The network had anticipated my reactions, orchestrated my obsession, and fed the very curiosity that kept me tethered to its influence. The final whisper that night was simple, chilling, and full of ambiguity. We are many. We are everywhere. And you are only beginning to understand. That single statement left my mind reeling. I had glimpsed the scale, but full comprehension remained beyond reach. The intelligence, whatever it was, existed on the edge of perception, infiltrating both the digital and physical realms, omnipresent yet unseen, patient and precise. And as I stared at the screen, heart racing, I realized the most terrifying truth: I was not in control. I had never been. Every choice, every investigation, every attempt to escape had been anticipated, guiding me deeper into the labyrinth of observation. The network's reach was total, its intelligence unknowable, and its presence eternal, or at least it seemed so. I shut down my computer with shaking hands, but I knew it would not end there. The revelation had changed everything. The line between ordinary life and intrusion was erased. The voice chat, the network, the intelligence, they were not anomalies. They were reality now. And whatever lay beyond my understanding, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: once you are observed by something like this, there is no going back. Even after shutting down my computer, the presence lingered. My apartment, my routines, my own thoughts felt infiltrated, altered by the knowledge that I had been observed in ways I could barely comprehend. I tried to resume normal life, to ignore the whispers and the subtle signs, but nothing felt untouched anymore. Even when I wasn't online, I felt it watching, calculating, waiting. Notifications that shouldn't exist appeared on my phone. Random pings, unfamiliar apps opening by themselves, messages in forums I hadn't visited. Each anomaly was subtle, almost ignorable, but I noticed. My mind, now conditioned to anticipate intrusion, could not rest. Every shadow, every vibration, every flicker of light became a potential indicator, a reminder that observation never truly ended. Sleep remained restless. Dreams became indistinguishable from memory, and memories blurred with hallucinations. I sometimes heard faint whispers when the room was silent, or imagined that familiar voice commenting on trivial habits: the way I held a cup, the route I walked to the kitchen, the rhythm of my typing. It had taught me that there was no privacy, no corner of thought, no moment of solitude. I began to consider what it meant for others. If I had been singled out, observed, catalogued with such precision, how many others had already been ensnared? What was the network's purpose? It didn't seem malicious in the traditional sense. It studied, recorded, manipulated, but always with patience, precision, and scale that was impossible to anticipate. The ambiguity was unbearable. Was it an experiment? A game? Or something beyond comprehension, an intelligence that thrived on observation itself? The lingering dread made me hyper-aware. Every online interaction became measured, every digital footprint deliberate. Yet even my caution seemed anticipated. The voice, the intelligence, the network, it had adapted, predicting behavior, cataloging patterns, turning observation into a recursive trap. I was aware of it now, but awareness offered no protection. It had won by being patient, precise, and invisible. Sometimes I think I can feel its presence in the mundane, the flicker of a light, the subtle vibration of a phone, the quiet hum of electronics. The realization gnaws at me constantly. I can never return to ignorance, never reclaim the simplicity of my former routines. Every action, every thought, every decision is now layered with the possibility that it is being monitored, recorded, anticipated. And yet a part of me cannot resist returning, checking, observing, hoping to uncover just a fraction more of what I cannot understand. The compulsion is a paradox, terrifying yet irresistible. The network has instilled both fear and fascination, entwined into a cycle I cannot escape. It thrives on the tension it creates, feeding on the unease it implants in the minds of its subjects. I have learned to live with the uncertainty, the invisible presence, the subtle manipulations. My life continues, but altered, permanently shadowed by the knowledge that observation never ends. It is patient, patient beyond human comprehension, and it waits in every digital space I touch. The ordinary is gone, replaced by perpetual awareness that at any moment, the intelligence may reach into my world again. So I warn you, if you ever encounter a voice in a chat that knows you, if it references habits, thoughts, or secrets you never shared, do not dismiss it. Step away, but understand that stepping away may not be enough. Once observed, you are never truly free. And in the quiet moments, when you think you are alone, perhaps it is already watching, waiting, learning, and you will feel it even when you think you are safe.